A day of poetry and song. A new song. These cloudless skies, this balmy air, this brilliant sunshine making December as pleasant as May, are in harmony with the glorious morning of liberty about to dawn upon us. Frederick Douglass, Watch Night Service. First, I would like to thank the Most High for allowing me to be used as his vessel. Secondly, I need to thank Dr. Bob Hill for asking me to share my thoughts with you regarding the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on Kansas City. December 31st, 1862, blacks, slave and free from all over the country, came together in what was called a watch night. They met in slave cabins and in churches to pray for Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation into law. Its impact will be felt immediately for generations thereafter. The Emancipation Proclamation legally acknowledged slavery as the cause of the Civil War and sanctioned the enlistment of blacks to fight for their own freedom, thus saving the nation. Its impact on Kansas City can be traced by measuring Kansas City's historic timeline of violence, coupled with the creation and most of all the enforcement of laws enacted to govern change. In the House of Representatives, power is based upon population. During slavery, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. With the Missouri Compromise of 1821, Missouri came into the Union as a slave state. Maine joined as a free state. Slavery was not to exist north of the 3630 Mason-Dixon line. In 1831, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, moving the Indians west. The Shawnee and the Wyandot were relocated from the Ohio River Valley. The Shawnee were brought into the Shawnee Indian Mission in Kansas, established by a slave owner, a reverend named Thomas Johnson. The Wyandot were given land in what is now known as Kansas City, Kansas. The slave revolts, led by Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey in Virginia and South Carolina, were inspired by the children of Israel in the Bible. To discourage runaway slaves and revolts in 1847, the Missouri legislature passed a law that made it illegal to teach blacks, slave or free, how to read. And they could not hold a church service without whites being present. John Berry Meacham was a free black who started the first African Baptist church in St. Louis, Missouri in 1825. He taught blacks to read in the basement of his church. Once the law was passed that made it illegal to teach blacks, slave or free, how to read, Meacham, a carpenter by trade, built a boat and parked it in the Mississippi River, and there on the boat he taught blacks to read. James Milton Turner was a student on Meacham's reading boat. Quindaro was established by the Wyandot Indian Nation and slave abolitionists from the East Coast known as Jayhawks as a port of entry for those people who wanted Kansas to come into the Union as a slave state. Slave patrollers were hired along the banks of the Missouri River to catch runaway slaves crossing the water over into the territory of Quindaro, where they would have the perception of being free, because Kansas was not a slave state. Yet in Kansas, they could be captured and brought back to their master. The Bloodhound Law, or the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, required law enforcement to capture any person suspected of being a runaway slave. With the signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Kansas was allowed to vote for itself, whether it be a free state or a slave state. Missouri slave owners went over into Kansas and voted illegally at the Shawnee Indian Mission for Kansas to come into the Union as a slave state. War erupted over the issue of slavery along the border of Missouri and the territory of Bleeding, Kansas, marking the unofficial start of the Civil War. In January of 1861, Kansas came into the Union as a free state. In April of that same year, the South Carolina militia attacked the United States Army, commencing the official beginning of the Civil War. Exemplified in the following quote, Lincoln's primary objective for the Civil War was saving the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause. I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be errors, and I shall adopt new views so fast as they shall appear to be true views. Initially, blacks were not recruited to fight in the Civil War because Lincoln did not want to upset slave states like Missouri, who still belonged to the Union, and he was reluctant to put guns in the hands of slaves for fear they would turn on their masters. Jayhawk Jim Lane illegally recruited blacks to join the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. They proved themselves in battle alongside whites in October of 1862 in the Battle of Island Mound. As the Union began to struggle in their efforts to suppress Confederate attacks, Lincoln abandoned his thinking when signing the Emancipation Proclamation became a necessary and fit war measure in order to save the Union. January 1 of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Lincoln went into effect, freeing slaves that were in states that had rebelled against the Union. Missouri never left the Union, so the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the slaves in Missouri, yet it caused many to run away. March 28, 1863, Confederate guerrillas looking for scapegoats to unleash their vengeance, frustrated that the Bloodhound Law was not being enforced to their satisfaction, forced the landing of the Sam Gaddy steamboat in Sibley, Missouri. The boat contained between 60 to 75 contraband slants. 15 to 20 slaves were marched down the gangplank to have their brains splattered about. Those left on the boat were able to escape into the woods. On August 14, 1863, a Union prison containing the relatives and sympathizers of Confederate guerrillas collapsed. It stood where the Sprint Center stands today in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. A slave named John Nolan, separated from his master, found refuge in the Confederate guerrillas led by William Quantrell. After the prison collapsed, he was told to go into Lawrence as a scout to gather information, then report back. Based on the information he provided, Quantrell's gang raided Lawrence, Kansas, killing 150 people. Bloody Bill Anderson killed 14 by himself. John Nolan, when he passed away, all his pallbearers were white Confederate sympathizers. To prevent guerrillas and Confederate sympathizers from working together, General Thomas Ewing signed General Order Number 11, mandating that everyone in Jackson, Cass, and Bates counties of Missouri, giving them 15 days to prove their loyalty to the Union. Those who proved their loyalty were removed to a military station in their assigned district. Everyone else was forced to move out of their district. It was considered the harshest law ever imposed on the American people by their own government. An all-black company of soldiers, commanded by blacks, known as Douglas Battery, was instrumental in the Confederate defeat at the Battle of Westport. They were commanded by William Matthews, Patrick Henry Minor, and Hezekiah Ford Douglas. It was the last major Confederate attack against the Union. The subject of slavery evoked pain, resentment, division, devastation, and evil spirits into the people of Kansas City. Jesse James saw his stepdad get interrogated with a noose around his neck. The Youngers in Jackson County saw their dad get murdered. The Reverend Johnson was often called upon to authenticate as to whether or not someone was truthful in regards to their loyalty to the Union, despite having sons fighting on both sides and owning slaves in the free state of Kansas. In September 27 of 1867, the Centralia Massacre took place. Bloody Bill Anderson, Jesse James, Archie Clement, and other guerrillas derailed a train of civilians and soldiers that were on furlough. After separating the civilians from the soldiers, 24 soldiers, with the exception of one, to be used as a hostage, were set aside, murdered, mutilated, and scalped. January 2nd of 1865, the Reverend Thomas Johnson was murdered at his home on 33rd and Agnes, 9 days before the slaves in Kansas City, Missouri were legally set free. During slavery, America produced 3/4 of the world's cotton supply, becoming the world economic power that she is today on the backs of slave labor. The time period from 1865 to 1877 was known as Reconstruction. With the Republicans in charge after the war, they empowered blacks while disenfranchising Confederates. On December 18, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery was adopted, except in the event that you commit a crime. Slavery was abolished except in the event that you commit a crime. You can be re-enslaved. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 defined citizenship, making all citizens equal by law. James Milton Turner, a student on Meacham's boat on the Mississippi River, put his life at risk in Liberty, Missouri and in southeast Missouri while establishing schools for freed men in Missouri. He was instrumental in organizing Penn School in Westport and Lincoln School on 10th and McGee in 1868. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. John Mercer Langston, Blanche K. Bruce, and Hiram Revels, also Robert Smalls and others, were elected to serve in the U.S. Senate and in Congress. Since Confederates were disenfranchised, they could not vote, they could not serve on juries, they could not preach sermons in church pulpits. The James and Younger gang began robbing banks during Reconstruction. They were blamed for the first daylight bank robbery during peacetime. It occurred in Clay County, Missouri, in February of 1866. Jesse James, he robbed the Kansas City Industrial Exposition in 1872, and then he bragged about it in the newspapers. In 1874, the slave patrols that had hid along the banks of the Missouri River to catch runaway slaves were replaced by the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. Because of the lack of enforcement of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, the Public Accommodations Law of 1875 was designed to protect all citizens in their civil and legal rights, to provide for equal treatment in public accommodations and public transportation, and to prohibit exclusion from jury service. Hotels like the Pacific House, located in the River Market of the Kansas City, reacted to the new laws by charging freed men higher prices for smaller rooms. As the James Younger gang grew more confident, they started robbing banks before they made it to the bank. They started robbing trains, before they made it to the bank, disrupting the federal economy. By 1882, Governor Thomas Crittenden had placed a $10,000 bounty on the head of Jesse James, which was collected by one of his associates. Bob Ford was at the home of Jesse James when he shot him in the back of the head to collect the bounty. 100 years after the Civil War, Horace Peterson, alumni of Central High School in Kansas City, Missouri, founded the Black Archives of Mid-American in 1974 to house artifacts and documents pertaining to African Americans in the middle of America and abroad. In 1980, Horace organized Kansas City's first Juneteenth celebration, commemorating the freeing of all African Americans in America. The event grew to be the second largest Juneteenth celebration in the nation, second only to the annual festival held in Galveston, Texas, where the holiday originated from. Watch night services are still held all over the nation to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Eve. It is also known as Freedom's Eve. Today, the privatizations of prisons Today, with the privatization of prisons, America imprisons more of its own citizens than any other country in the world. The constant incidents of police brutality directed against African Americans is proof everyone does not have equal protection of the law. If you are convicted as a felon and have had your voting rights taken away, they can be restored once you are no longer on probation and parole. Knowledge of the past allows us to make sense of the present and gives us insight into the future. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Bob Hill for allowing me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on Kansas City. Please visit us at www.kansascitytourcompany.com to explore more of Kansas City's rich history and culture. We offer the following tours on a regular basis: Streetcar KC, a River City Civil Rights Tour; Streetcar KC, a River City Mafia Tour; and Bebop and Beyond, 18th and Vine Walking Tour. To confirm your tour booking, visit us at www.kansascitytourcompany.com. Thank you.